Speaking of craziness and problems, this week's Open, I want to touch on something because we've seen this song and dance before when it comes to NASCAR and Goodyear tire problems. And this last week at Texas was no exception. We once again saw problems with the tires. We saw it the weekend before at Bristol. Now, a lot of the tire problem was also overshadowed by the steering pump issue, right? The whole rack and pinion issues with the steering setup they've got on the cars now. And I believe that's something that'll be fixed. Bristol is unique. We talked about that last week. And I also believe that the issue with the tire will eventually be fixed. But it brings up an interesting uh, discussion when it comes to unintended consequences. And we see this all the time in sports, right? We see this all the time in society. It's just one of those things where the rule makers, whatever you want to call them, the powers that be, those in charge, right? They will go into a situation or come up with the rule or a concept or a design, whatever it may be, and they have the greatest of intentions, but they never look past what could be the unintended consequences. And this is what we're seeing right now with a lot of the tire issues. Now, we can look just settle this right now. Are all of the tire issues on the teams? No. Are 100% of the tire issues on Goodyear? No. All right. There has to be some part of this where it's like, look, this is a new tire. They're running something they've never ran even close to before, right? Like when NASCAR went from the bias ply to the radial tire, at least the dimensions were basically the same. Okay, so there was a lot of similarities between the tires. The flex of the tire, the way that you could slide around with it, right? The limit of the tire when you start talking about coefficient of friction, stuff like that, was different. But the overall design of it, the size of it, stuff like that was the same. Now we're going to something completely different. We talked about this last week. It's wider. The sidewall is much, much smaller. Remember, those sidewalls are literally like springs. They have their own spring rate to it. So it's a completely different concept. And right now we've got these teams that are pushing the envelope. And that's what race car teams and drivers do. That's what they do. All right? That is in fact, that's not only what they do, that's your job. Okay, like that's just your job. It is to go out there and get the absolute most that you can get out of that car for the duration of the race, whether it's 400 miles or 500 laps or whatever. And we saw a ton of tire failures this last week. And one of the issues that I don't think is being brought up enough, I believe it has to do with the unintended consequences of other rules in place. Rodney Childers made a really good point, and I actually think this is one of the biggest causes of the tire issues we're seeing, where he talked about, hey, these limiters that you have got on these shocks, let us take those off. Right now, they're running these low air pressures because they're trying to get those cars to the optimal ride height for that rear diffuser. And the more that they're figuring out how to really optimize that underbody, right? That underwing and that rear diffuser, they're getting more side force, they're getting more down force. This is allowing creating a much greater load. And when you are having to run lower pressures to do this, you end up with the issues that we saw this last week at Texas. If you look at every blown tire, minus one, I think there was one that happened in turns 1 and 2, if I'm remembering correctly. Every other blown tire happened in 3 and 4, which is the high banked, high speed turn, where the load was at its max. And I understand NASCAR, right? Them having these rules in place because the last thing they want is what we had with the Gen 6 car, right? Where you have one side of the car that is as smooth as glass, the other side of the car protrudes out 2 feet for side force, right? The car's skewed over 10 degrees. It looks like it's crab walking when it's going straight down the backstretch. You know what I mean? Like the teams had done so much to these cars. The only thing that made them even recognizable to an actual, production car was the sticker on the nose. That was it. So I understand them not wanting that to happen again. But there has to be some form of give and take with this, especially when these teams can fix a lot of the issues, right? You look at the steering rack, you know, think about the level of frustration that you must have as a crew chief, a team owner, a driver, when you can look at that component and you can say, we can fix that problem. Our team can fix that problem, but we're not allowed to because that is a component that must be purchased and not messed with. And it leads to these unintended consequences. And that is what I think we're seeing right now. Goodyear can come out and say, oh, the teams are doing this, and the teams can come out and say Goodyear's doing this, and NASCAR can say that they're both doing it. At the end of the day, this is a product of things that have been put in place, and teams doing whatever they can do to find the most speed to win races. Because at the end of the day, that's their job. And so until some of this stuff gets changed, and I'm not saying they need to have just wholesale changes and be like, all right, we're getting rid of all the restrictions. And I'm not saying that, but they need to really look at these things going forward, because the biggest problem that I'm hearing today and throughout this whole week is that this is just a Goodyear problem, right? Oh, it's just a Goodyear problem. Goodyear needs to fix XYZ. That's not necessarily the case. Okay? Could they improve stuff? Yes, they could, right? But even if they improve stuff, and Keith, you know this, as a former race car driver, you're going to push everything to the absolute max, right? Even when we
Oh,
had the cars that they understood and they understood the tires, they still would push those tires to the max, right?
oh,
So,
100%.
yeah. So the teams are always going to do that. And unless NASCAR can figure out a way, and what they need to do, in my opinion, is get with these teams and start looking at some of this stuff. This whole, just, you cannot touch any component that you get from a supplier is, I I understand it on a lot of stuff. There's a lot of things though to where it just seems ridiculous, and to me it's causing issues that don't need to be happening. Because think about this, Keith. What happens if we go into Phoenix, right? Or Vegas, right? Vegas is a mile and a half track, a fast mile and a half track. Homestead, fast mile and a half track. And you got guys fighting to get into the final four, and they're dealing with these types of tire problems, right? It doesn't matter if their team pushed the envelope too much. The narrative has been written. The tires are an issue, right? What kind of uproar are we going to see with that?
Oh, man. I think you'd see NASCAR get burned down by the fans.
Exactly, right? Like, people don't want to see that. People want to see good racing. And I heard a lot of people this last weekend talking about how this race was like the Indianapolis Goodyear debacle.
Ooh,
That
ooh.
that's
Oh,
that's an all-timer, okay? For those of you who
yeah.
are saying that, you must not have watched that race, okay? Because
Terrible.
Texas, although we had some tire problems this last weekend, it was not Indianapolis. That was an all-timer in
What
terms of just shit shows.
what was it they were doing? They would run 10-lap
It
stints
was
and then
10
throw a
lap
yellow
steps,
because
competition cautions at 10 laps.
every 10 laps.
For
What a shit show.
500 miles. I mean, it was
Yeah,
insane. Yeah, and even then, you still had cars that couldn't make it like 7 or 8 laps. They were starting to have tire
yeah.
failures after 7 or 8 laps. It was
It
an absolute cluster.
At least with the issue now,
Mhm.
or the issue this Sunday, at least the issue is every 30 laps, and it wasn't even really every 30 laps. It was
Yeah, it's
35-ish,
like
give
35
or
to
take.
40, somewhere right around there.
But, I completely agree. I think it's time to put a lot of this back in the team's hands. It's NASCAR points a finger at Goodyear, Goodyear points a finger at NASCAR, and then they both point the fingers at the teams, and it's like, no.
Yeah,
Goodyear needs
exactly.
to work with the teams to figure out what's
Yep.
going on here. Me personally, I don't think they were ready for the load. I don't think they
No.
understood the load that was gonna be put on the back tires. Nobody
Mhm.
knew. I mean, it was a big
No.
unknown,
Yeah, and
and
I
it ain't
think
like the tire deal's been a secret all year. It's been a
yeah.
since day one.
Well, and I think that's one of the we keep hearing them talk about how, they got this concept is from the GT3 world and that type of thing. And, GT3 cars, yes, run rear diffusers. GT3 cars go out and run for hours and hours and hours at a time. GT3 cars do not create nowhere near the amount of load or corner force as a NASCAR does. Right? When you talk about sailing a car in at 175 miles an hour on 28 degrees of banking, right? Like that creates a level of force on a tire that is not being generated by really any
Any
other
other car.
car out there, right? I mean, you have very F1 maybe at a couple of corners that they race. I mean, everything else, it's there's nothing else like it. So, it's a completely different concept than anything that they've ever done, right? In terms of taking that model of tire where you talk about wide with the very low profile and then having to adapt that to NASCAR. And it's going to take time. And I just hope that they can at least get it to where we don't have the failures deciding races before the end of this season.